Francis Fukuyama, author of the book The End of History and the Last Man. What's it all about?
Well, it's an imposing title. The book is about the question of whether there exists such a thing as what I would call history with a capital H. We usually associate history with just the routine flow of events, you know, the war in the Persian Gulf, the fall of the Berlin Wall. But my book tries to ask a larger question, whether there is such a thing as a history of human society, taking into account the experiences of all peoples in virtually all times, and whether there is a kind of coherent evolution in the nature of those societies as they progress from, you know, very primitive agricultural, tribal societies up through various monarchies and aristocracies, up to the kind of liberal democracy and technologically driven capitalism that we have today. And the end of history refers to what I think still remains a question of whether that process is one that can terminate, whether that evolution, you know, finally culminates in a certain kind of civilization that in a certain sense will be the last civilization that mankind will achieve, because in a certain sense it's the right one, it's the one that fits human nature in an appropriate way. And what I argue in the book is that liberal democracy comes much closer to fitting human nature in that sense than virtually any type of prior, you know, form of government or political organization or social organization.
When you say liberal democracy, what do you mean by liberal democracy?
Well, it's an important distinction. I mean, democracy, we have a good sense, you know, it means something like elections, multi-party, you know, secret ballot elections. But the kind of society we live in is a liberal democracy. It's elections plus guarantees of certain, you know, fundamental rights of individuals, like freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of political association, and most importantly, the freedom to participate, you know, in the political system. And so, you know, a true liberal democracy has to have both, you know, the election side of it and the constitutional or legal guarantees of individual rights. And when those are brought together, I think you have, you know, the essence of contemporary political systems.
Can you name a democracy that you wouldn't put liberal in front of?
Oh, sure. In fact, there are a number of them now appearing in the Islamic world. And for instance, you know, Iran now, Khomeini's Iran, or the post-Khomeini Iran, you know, I think can claim the title to being a more or less democratic country. They have elections of a sort. They're not the fairest elections, but there are elections. But, you know, it's absolutely an illiberal country. Women don't have rights. They can't participate in the political process. There's no freedom of religion. There's certainly no freedom of speech. It's a real, you know, problem in many parts of the Arab world. For instance, in Algeria right now, you're having the struggle between a fundamentalist Islamic group that really, I think, is very likely. I mean, it was expected to win a majority in the election that was taking place. Now, democratically, they were elected, but their program is not liberal. I mean, they have no intention of guaranteeing things like freedom of religion and freedom of speech, and it's a real, you know, problem in that kind of society. If they're elected to power, the first thing they're going to do is to disenfranchise a certain part of the population. And so, you know, it's very important that democracies be liberal democracies as well as, you know, simply based on popular sovereignty. You know, I think part of the problem is simply a matter of misunderstanding or misinterpretation of what, you know, what the end of history represented. You know, what I was referring to was really the growth of a kind of universal consensus on the, you know, the justness or the rightness of the principles of liberal democracy, that was really the remarkable fact about our world. And so, but I'm afraid that, you know, what happened was a lot of people, you know, simply saw the title and they said, well, what's this? I mean, it's absurd, you know, history's not going to end. You know, we still have wars and poverty and, you know, a lot of struggle in the third world and things of that sort. So, you know, prima facie, it's an absurd thing. And there's a lot of controversy simply over, I think, the misinterpretation. But underneath that, there really is a more serious question that, you know, it used to be that there were many alternative forms of government, monarchies and fascist dictatorships, and, you know, for many years we thought communism was our, you know, major rival, an alternative, you know, type of civilization. And one by one, in this century, every one of those has collapsed. And, you know, not every country is a liberal democracy. There are many dictatorships of the right and the left remaining. But, you know, as a systematic idea that has some dynamism and some real vitality, liberal democracy is really all there is now. And we've seen that now in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, that communism was in a sense undermined by the fact that people did not believe, that that was a viable form of government, that it had no legitimacy, and that in fact democratic ideas were, the primary ones that people found, exciting and just and worthy of emulation. I really have two very separate explanations. The first really has to do, in a way, with economics. But if you look around the world, there's an extremely high correlation between, stable democracy and prosperity and the highest levels of, economic development. So if you look at Western Europe, Japan, North America, these are all areas that are both, highly advanced technological capitalist countries, and they're also very stable democracies. And that indicates that there is some kind of a correlation between, a country's ability to industrialize in a, in an advanced way and its ability to sustain democracy. And I think you can account for a lot of the, the underlying cause of many of the recent transitions to democracy in Spain and Portugal and, in many parts of Latin America, certainly in the Soviet Union. It does have to do with the fact that as economic development occurs, as a country industrializes, as it becomes more urban, it becomes therefore more educated. You create a certain kind of middle class that, is raised and trained, to be literate, to, take an understanding of their own affairs. And, ultimately, I think people like that, a middle class society like that begins to demand a certain degree of democratic participation. And you can see it in a variety of countries around the world. In South Korea, the military dictatorship was finally overthrown in the late 1980s, and that came at the end of a period where it had gone through a remarkable, period of economic development. It developed, it's, say 10, 15 years behind Japan in terms of turning itself into a modern, consumer society. And I think at a certain point, people in Korea started to say to themselves, well, it's ridiculous that we have this kind of military government. We want to be able to participate and to, be a democracy like the rest of the developed world. And, there are other cases of that. So that's one explanation that, forms one of the pillars, in a sense, of my argument. But, the other one is in a way, a more philosophical one and somewhat more difficult to understand. These economic explanations for democracy, I think, are ultimately not really satisfying because, in the last analysis, people don't want democracy for economic reasons. I mean, you can have, a high-growth society without a lot of political freedom. I mean, there are a lot of countries in Asia, Singapore and Thailand and so forth, that are like that. And I think that, if you look more deeply at what it is that drives societies to want democracy, you always end up with a non-economic cause. And for that reason, in the book, I go back to the German philosopher Hegel rather than, to Karl Marx with his economic theories of history. And, the reason for going back to Hegel is that Hegel had a theory of history, a theory of how human societies progress and evolve into higher, forms of organization that was based not on economics, but on what he called the struggle for recognition. That is to say, a completely non-economic goal that we as human beings want to be recognized as, as human beings with a certain dignity and human freedom. And it is that, search for recognition that leads to the relationship of masters and slaves. It's that lies behind, in a certain way, religion and, movements like nationalism, but that ultimately, that's also the way to explain democracy. That's why we want democracy. It's not that it, creates capitalist prosperity for us, but that it is a political system that by giving us individual rights, recognizes our dignity as human beings, and that this is the essential driving force behind democratic revolutions, whether they take place in Eastern Europe or in Asia or in Latin America. Well, the French Revolution for Hegel really represented it was the coming of the end of history, so to speak. Now, by the French Revolution, we don't mean just a limited historical event. What we mean is the emergence of what we understand as modern liberal democracy, because in the French Revolution, ultimately, what it was about was a revolution in favor of the principles of liberty and equality. Now, you could substitute the American Revolution for that, because I think, in a kind of ideological sense, those two revolutions were equivalent. I mean, they were both, revolutions to create, what I earlier defined as a liberal democracy, a political system based on popular sovereignty with, guarantees of individual rights. And for Hegel, the coming of the French Revolution was, the event that heralded the end of history, because it meant that the principles of liberty and equality on which, modern liberal democracy is based had finally been discovered and had been implemented, only in a small corner of Europe back in the late 18th century, but at least the principle was established. And I think, modern Hegelians would argue that what's happened in the 200 years since the French Revolution is, simply the implementation of those principles around the world. That, in other words, we haven't progressed, in any fundamental sense since the French Revolution.
Besides Hegel, who of that list that I gave are the most interesting to you?
Well, I think the other, the other towering figure that is really by far the most important was the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And it's from him that the part of the title, The Last Man, comes, because he, in a certain sense, was the philosopher that argued that, well, yes, if there's been historical progress, perhaps, but it's led not to, greater human happiness, but to a total disaster. And in a way, the book is about, you might say, a dialogue between these two philosophers as to, how we ought to evaluate the goodness and how satisfactory is our society at the end of history.
You write a lot about something called the struggle for recognition. What's that all about?
Well, the struggle for recognition is, in my view, the motor that drives this process of human history. And it's a concept that comes from Hegel, but that is to say, all human beings, want to be recognized. That is to say, they want other human beings to, affirm their value or their goodness or their dignity or, their freedom. And, according to a philosopher like Hegel, history starts because of a struggle. It begins with a battle, a conflict over recognition where, in a sense, one caveman gets up and says to the next caveman, I want you to recognize me, that I'm greater than you, I'm your lord and master, and they fight over that. And, according to Hegel, the result of that is a relationship of master and slave, because one of these early men submits and the other, wins the victory. And so you have this very unequal relationship of lord and master that, on the one hand, and slave on the other that, that grows up. But all of the major phenomenon of, human history can be understood in a certain sense as a form of recognition. I mean, we all want recognition of our own value. For instance, something like contemporary nationalism is not driven by any kind of economic motive. It's driven by the nationalist desire that his nation, his group, his ethnic group, whatever, be recognized as a nation among others. So in Lithuania, for example, we've just seen, a very vivid recent example of this, that, the Lithuanians didn't want, greater wealth, or in fact, their struggle for national independence cost them a lot, in terms of, their wealth and their economic development. What they wanted was recognition of their status as an equal, among other nations. And it's an extremely powerful force. I mean, you can see it, tearing apart Yugoslavia today, that the Croats and the Slovenes, want national recognition. The Serbs in those areas want, recognition for themselves. And so, I think you can see much of the 20th century, all these, nationalist wars as in a way, a manifestation of the same basic desire for recognition, for human recognition. And so it stands at the core of a lot of what's, evil and unjust and leads to violence in our world. Or religion, in a certain sense, can be understood as a form of recognition, because a religious believer wants, other people to recognize his gods and his idols and his, sacred practices. At the core of our humanity, that in a certain sense, that is what makes us human beings, much more so than, other aspects. For instance, we have an animal side. We all want, we need to sleep, we need to eat, we need shelter, sex, we need a lot of biological sorts of things. But what makes us uniquely human is our desire to be recognized by other people. And this is ultimately what leads us into political life, because politics is really about recognition. It's a struggle for recognition.
You've got a paragraph talking about the end of history, and I'll read a little bit of it. The end of history would mean the end of wars and bloody revolutions. Agreeing on ends, men would have no large causes for which to fight. They would satisfy their needs through economic activity, but they would no longer have to risk their lives in battle. They would, in other words, become animals again, as they were before the bloody battle that began history. A dog is content to sleep in the sun all day, provided he is fed, because he is not to sleep in the sun all day, because he is not dissatisfied with what he is. He does not worry that other dogs are doing better than him, or that his career as a dog is stagnated, or that dogs are being oppressed in a distant part of the world. If man reaches a society in which he has succeeded in abolishing injustice, his life will resemble that of a dog. Finally, human life then involves a curious paradox. It seems to require injustice, for the struggle against injustice is what calls forth what is highest in man.
Well, that's right. That is a central paradox of human life, because in a certain sense, if we can achieve what we all want, a perfectly just society where all men are recognized, and treated equally, in which there's great material prosperity, in a certain way that robs us of, a very important side of life, which is the side that wants to struggle, that wants great causes, that wants to act and to live and to die for ideals, for higher causes, or that somehow wants to transcend, just the satisfaction of the body and its needs and that sort of thing. Thumos is, it's a Greek word that comes from Plato that represents a certain part of the soul, that it is a part of the soul, or, to put it in modern terms, it's a part of the personality or the part of the human psyche that precisely demands recognition. And, according to Plato, there are three parts of the soul. There's the desiring part, so we understand what that is. It's like the part that desires food and water and so forth. And there's reason, human capacity to calculate and to make decisions based on fundamental logic, this sort of thing. But Plato says that there's a third part of the soul, which is thumos, which essentially is, in a way, it's the source of self-esteem. It's the valuing part of the soul. It's the part of the soul that says, yes, I am a human being, I have a certain dignity or worth, and I am proud of that worth. And it's impossible really to reduce, any understanding of human psychology simply to desire and reason alone. And, there's a very important assertive side of the human personality that, that wants recognition and demands, that other people recognize me at my worth, at my understanding of what I'm worth. Now, megalothumia is a word, it's another Greek word, but one that I made up myself. Megalos in Greek means great, and thumia, refers to thumos. And megalothumia is a word meaning the desire to be recognized as greater than other people. And in my view, this is, in a way, the sense of both things that are good about politics and things that are bad about it, because a tyrant is, in a way, a prototype of the person that wants to be recognized as greater.
You also write later on, it says, it is in the very design of democratic capitalist countries like the United States that the most talented and ambitious natures should tend to go into business rather than into politics, the military, universities, or the church. Mm-hmm. Why?
Well, I think that's right. We are potentially threatened by would-be tyrants that have this megalothumia, that want to be recognized as greater. It is much safer if they become Ted Turners than if they become, let's say, politicians or military, people that will, turn their desire to be recognized as greater into, some political, movement or cause. In a way, it would have been much better if, if Hitler had stayed out of politics and gone into the sign painting business and then become the Ted Turner of house painting in Germany in the 1920s. I mean, he would have made a lot of money. He may have gotten quite recognized as a very innovative, house painter or whatever. And we would have been spared, a lot of the fascist politics of that period. And I think that, part of the wisdom of the American founding was an understanding that, this kind of business activity would be able to absorb the talents and ambitions of, of people that were inclined in that fashion, but turn it to a kind of public good so that, they produce wealth for, the rest of society. But the main thing is that they're kept in an occupation that uses their ambitions and talents and gives it a certain outlet without creating a political tyranny as a result. In our country, that we have a constitutional system that is essentially designed to constrain ambitious people. It's designed to constrain people with megalothumia, the Napoleon or the Stalin or the Saddam Hussein that, would enter American politics and want to, turn it into some kind of a, dictatorship. And that's why we have this system of checks and balances and the three branches of government and that sort of thing to constrain political ambition. First of all, ambition is pushed into the area of business and economic activity. And for those that are not satisfied by it, they have, the system where they have to go around, promising, voters, that they'll deliver on certain goods, but completely constrained by a system of law, that forces their political energies into certain very safe, well, perhaps not productive, but at least not terribly harmful directions. And that's, in a way, the genius of our political system. The real problem with communism, with communist societies, was not that they were economically inefficient or didn't, produce a West German standard of living for East Germans. The problem was a kind of moral one, that it forced people to make compromises with themselves, with, their thumos in a way was compromised. They could not rise above themselves precisely because these communist governments dangled a kind of consumer culture in front of them. It wasn't a very rich consumer culture, but they dangled things like, a better apartment or a refrigerator or possibly a car or a vacation in Bulgaria, in front of people. And it said, look, if you people want to be parts of this system, if you want to have a successful career, if you want to get along, if you want your vacation in Bulgaria, then you have to sign this petition denouncing your colleagues, or you have to shut up, when you see someone being, unjustly persecuted by the party, and that sort of thing. And, I think if you look at the writings of someone like Václav Havel, you'll see that that's precisely what he identifies as the real evil of the system. I mean, it wasn't that, it produced shoddy goods and no food on the shelves. It was that morally it was a bankrupt system because it really made people accept this Faustian bargain, in a sense, to trade away their souls for the sake of a few, meager consumer goods.
You used the greengrocer story with Mr. Havel to make a point. What was it?
Well, he tells this very, amusing story in an essay that he wrote while he was still in jail called The Power of the Powerless, in which a greengrocer hangs a sign in front of his window that says, "Workers of the world unite," and Havel goes into some of the psychology behind why he should do a thing like that. And he said, well, does he really believe that the workers of the world should unite? And he says, well, no. The real reason that the greengrocer did it is that he's afraid. He's afraid that if he doesn't put that sign in his window, then the communist authorities will come and, they will harass him or threaten him with jail or various other, terrible things that they could do to him. And Havel says, what the sign really says, if you can look beneath the surface, is not "Workers of the world unite." It is, "I am afraid. I am a humble greengrocer living in this political system, and I know that if I don't go along, I will suffer the consequences, and therefore I'm obedient, and I want to show my superiors that I'm obedient." And so in a way, I mean, this is a way of his demonstrating, the moral complicity that was required to, live in that kind of a society. And he said that, people could avoid facing up to that because they put up a high-minded slogan like "Workers of the world unite," and they, because of ideology, they could tell themselves, well, I'm not really compromising my moral worth. What I'm doing is, saying some high-minded slogan. But nonetheless, that compromise existed, and that was the real, that was the evil of the system.
So let me get right to it. The End of History was written 30 years ago it came out in the summer, well, actually it's 30 and a half years, more like 31 years. It was published in June of 1989. I was in the State Department at the time, so it was before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I have now spent 31 years being asked, well, what about the end of history? Wasn't that completely wrong? And and this didn't start recently. I mean, this started virtually the moment I published that piece. So I just want to get a couple of things out, just so there's not any misunderstanding. The end of history was not my phrase. It comes from the philosopher Hegel. History, in his understanding, is what we would today call modernization or development. And end did not mean termination. It meant objective, target. And so the question of the end of history is, where does the modernization process lead to? What's the highest form of human, social, and political organization? And what I said was, the Marxists, for the last 150 years, have been saying the end of history is going to be communism. And my observation in really the summer of 1988 or the winter of 1988-89, when Gorbachev was reforming the Soviet Union, was that it didn't look like we would get there, that we would stop at the stage before communism, which the Marxists called bourgeois democracy. And I didn't see a higher form of society that would replace liberal democracy. All right, so that was the thesis. So people keep asking me, do I still believe it? I believe it in the following form. I have not heard anyone posit an alternative political economic form other than liberal democracy tied to a market economy that I think will be a higher form of human civilization, that will produce higher levels of prosperity and more happiness for the people that live in it. The only alternative that I think is a serious one is actually the one that the Chinese have been developing, because it's definitely not democratic, and it's been quite successful economically. And I've always said right from the beginning that, another 20 years or so, if they're richer than the United States and they're still stable and it looks like it's an ongoing enterprise, then I'll admit I was wrong. There really is an alternative, and that may be it. But I have reasons for thinking that may not be the case. Now, if you fast forward 30 years, obviously, we're living in a very different period. We're not expanding the world democracies anymore the way we were in 1989. And in fact, we've been in a period of setback. It's taken two forms. So one is the rise of Russia and China, authoritarian regimes that are very aggressive and self-confident. And the other form is the rise of populism in the United States, in Britain, in Hungary, in Poland, in Italy, in any number of other countries. The problem with populism is it's not democracy, because these populist leaders are legitimately elected by the people. The problem is that they almost always attack the liberal part of liberal democracy, meaning the constitutional order, checks and balances, the rule of law. They don't like anything that gets in the way of their implementation of the people's, so-called people's will. And that includes, unfortunately, my president, Donald Trump, who, the moment he came into office, set about trying to undermine all of the institutions in the United States that limit executive power. And I think a lot of us in the US are really scared of what's going to happen if this guy gets reelected in November, because he's going to feel that the American people really have given him a mandate to keep doing what he's doing in a way that really doesn't know any kinds of bounds, institutional bounds. And this has already happened in Hungary. I mean, it's going on in any number of other countries, and that, I think, is the other big danger that we face. Now, I just want to say, so I want to connect the end of history and the last man to my latest book, Identity, just to point out that there is actually some continuity there. By the way, people keep asking me, have you ever considered rewriting the end of history and the last man? And my answer is, I've done it already. I have a 2-volume book that runs to about 1,200 pages called The Origins of Political Order, and then Political Order and Political Decay. And that basically is my rewriting of the end of history and the last man. And there's some important differences in my perspective, because in the latter 2 volumes, I talk about political decay, that societies can go backwards as well as going forwards. And I think I appreciate better how hard it is to create a modern impersonal state and so forth. So if you're interested in that, I would send you to those books. But the last book, Identity, has a lot of continuity with The End of History and The Last Man. The last man in the title of the book comes from the philosopher Nietzsche. And he said that at the end of history, the last man will appear. The last man is a man without a chest, with no pride or anger or aspiration, because all of his needs have been taken care of. You know, he has peace and security and prosperity, and people are going to rebel against this. And I said this in The End of History and The Last Man, talking about future threats to democracy, that people want to struggle. And if their society doesn't give them things to struggle against that are just, they're going to struggle for unjust things. And that this was a perpetual challenge. I mentioned Donald Trump back in that original book. At that time, I thought that one of the advantages of a capitalist economic system was that these fantastically ambitious people like Trump could be satisfied just by making a lot of money. And that would bleed off all their energy, and then that would keep the political system safe from, you know, a new Julius Caesar. And little did I know that he actually failed as a businessman. He went bankrupt twice. So then he goes into reality TV and becomes a reality TV star. And in order to get the recognition, which is the real driver behind Identity, he runs for president, and now we're stuck with him. But the important concept that was embedded there is something based on this Greek word thumos. Thumos is a part of the human psychology that demands respect and recognition. And if you do not get respect or recognition, you get angry. So in modern Greek, as I understand it, the word thumos still exists, and it means anger. And I think a lot of politics, modern politics, is actually about a struggle for recognition, that people don't just want peace and security and prosperity. They want respect and dignity. They want the public recognition of that dignity. And I think what's happened in the last few years is that globalization has produced a large class of people in many countries that do not feel respected. It's been great for elites, you know, the kind of people that go to the Munich Security Conference and are cosmopolitan and well-connected to the global economy. But there's a lot of people that have less education. Their jobs have been taken away as a result of outsourcing and downsizing and so forth. And they're really pretty unhappy that the elites really don't take them very seriously, don't even recognize their struggles. And I think a lot of populism has arisen because of this thumos, you know, this anger at non-recognition. And what these populist politicians do is they feed on that, and they are able to blame foreigners, whether foreign competitors or immigrants, working together with the elites that have structured the game against them. And that's really what, you know, I think is undermining our liberal democracy right now. And so I think that that's the kind of dilemma we're in, that people don't just want peace and prosperity, they also want respect, and our system doesn't give it to them you know, there are lots of groups that really don't get that. On the left, you know, they tend to be identity groups like, you know, racial minorities, immigrants, women, gays and lesbians. On the right now, we're seeing basically the old majority white working class rising up and saying, well, what about us? You know, you're paying all this attention to women and blacks and gays and so forth, but what about us ordinary people? We're not getting respect either. And that's the, you know, the unfortunate kind of polarization that we're seeing now. So that, you know, is a way of tying together the first book I wrote and the latest book I wrote, because they're actually dealing with the same, in many ways, with the same phenomenon. I'm not going to make any predictions about how this is all going to end up. I tend to think that people have gotten a little bit too pessimistic about the prospects for democracy, because people really don't like living in authoritarian countries, and we've seen that, you know, in in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Sudan, in Algeria, in Nicaragua, in Hong Kong, in a lot of other places. And so I think that there's still, this hunger for a kind of just and free order, but getting to that, as I put it in another book, getting to Denmark is not that easy. And I think that that's where we've fallen down. So I'll just stop with that.